Oof.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Ask people if there's a prayer to someone. See how it goes.
Hello everyone. Can you hear me okay? Grant. Do you want to give your mic a wee try?
Yes, hey. Yeah, it's working.
Perfect. Hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming along, especially on a very, very cold evening. Although we had a very, very nice day. I hope all of you got the chance to kind of like take in a bit of that sun. But yeah, so we're here to celebrate Saleem Haddad's new novel, Floodlines, which is an incredible generational novel that follows the story of the Mazloom family as they were trying to kind of like reckon with the patriarch's legacy, Haidar Mazloom, who was a very famous Iraqi artist of the modernist tradition, and they're just and then kind of like as you go through the narrative, the story unfolds of kind of like just what the family has gone through their lives, and especially kind of like the three sisters and Nizar as well. And yeah, I'll just give a wee brief intro for Saleem himself, and then we'll hear a wee reading, and then a 30-minute chat and 50-minute Q&A, so you'll get a chance to ask your questions as well. So Saleem Haddad is the author of Guapa and Floodlines, and
I said we were going to keep
we
the
said we were going to keep the introductions very short. So yeah.
So we can just leave it at that.
Yeah. Everyone, please welcome Saleem to the stage.
Thank you. It's really lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Are we reading?
Should we start with a reading? Just out of curiosity, no one here was at my event yesterday, right? Okay, great. So I can do the same reading. So I'm going to do a short reading from the beginning of the book, and it's from the perspective of the son of one of the sisters in the family. The son is called Nizar. He's a war journalist, and his mother has just called him. His mother Zainab has just called him because she wants him to get in touch with her sister Ishtar. And I should say as well that there's some strong content here around war and violence and also sexual imagery. So just to warn people, if that's something that you're comfortable with, then yeah, be aware of that. I need you to visit Ishtar. His mother's voice was clear. Nizar asked her to repeat herself anyway. I need you to get the family story out of her. Nizar looked down from the edge of his balcony. 3 floors below, the concrete felt welcoming in its hardness. I want nothing to do with her, he said. Nizar, I have no one else to turn to. I want to arrange this while your grandmother is still with us, and I don't know how much time. Nizar heard the flick of his mother's lighter at the other end of the line. Look, I'm just asking for this one thing. Get her to tell you the family history and write it down for me. Why don't you just pay her to do it? Zainab sighed. Because I know my sister. She'll take the money, find some way to say that it's morally reprehensible to force her to narrativize or to simplify, and then not do it. I haven't spoken to her since that dinner, he said, resenting how easily his mother forced him to unpack memories he had long ago sealed off. I suspect she's in a fragile state, Zainab said. She's always in a fragile state. Yes, but this ISIS stuff has really... Zainab interrupted herself and took a deep drag of her cigarette. Anyway, do you have any upcoming work trips? Nizar looked over to the flats across the canal. In one, an old man in a bathrobe typed steadily at his desk. I don't do that kind of work anymore. What do you mean? He considered how to explain this decision to his mother. How to tell her that after moving out of the flat with Alfie, he had been walking around his new neighborhood in Hackney when he noticed a CrossFit gym under one of the station arches. How he had found himself entranced by the young, hard-bodied trainers with garish tattoos. How they strutted through the white powdered chalk hanging in the air, slapping each other's backs. How in the past he had scoffed at those who had invested hours sculpting a body that would inevitably decay. But in that moment, realized his long-held belief that an investment in the mind was forever, now struck him as naive. How he had paid a membership fee and began to go every day. How he found the anti-intellectualism to be a reprieve. Because there was no chance for the mind to wander during a workout. He could only focus on his form, his breath, his weights. How he powered through sets of grueling circuits named after American soldiers who died in Iraq and Afghanistan. And how after each class he collapsed on the floor of the gym, his muscles sore for days, a satisfying pain. How his shoulders broadened, his thighs thickened, and his pecs swelled. How muscles he never knew existed emerged underneath his skin. How disciplining his body brought control in a collapsing world. And how, when the instructors yelled, "Feel the burn," he thought not of the searing flesh from the explosion, but of the lactic acid burning through his muscles. How when he began to follow men on social media who demonstrated workout routines and discussed the virtues of bone broth, his algorithm interspersed half-naked men with brutalized Palestinian bodies and shell-shocked Syrian boys, their body parts like cuts of meat, here a thigh, there a torso, and how he was no longer sure if the photos were there to arouse or enrage. How his new body brought a different kind of attention, and in the spring, while scrolling through endless torsos on Grindr, a message appeared that caught his eye. 90 quid to suck your cock. How when the man came over, heavy-set, in his 50s, he gave Nizar the money, and all Nizar had to do was unzip his trousers. It was so damn easy, and a few days he did it again and again. And as the bodies piled up and the atrocities multiplied, he recoiled at those who touted the virtues of journalism, who defended the media as heroes in pursuit of the truth. Whose truth? With the right spin, a government could push news of a massacre off the headlines. How could he tell his mother that it was more moral to sell his body than to sell his soul for some bullshit idea of the truth? He no longer believed that journalists were truth seekers. They were carriers of the apocalypse, scavengers for a story, desperate for clicks, exposing global misery to pad their pockets, leading the masses down whirlpools of clickbait, the curators of an assembly line of death that floated down social media feeds and quickly disappeared, until everyone forgot what it was they were so angry about, only that they had a fireball of rage inside of them, throbbing and ready to explode. He saw it in his own feed, the way news drifted down his timeline like the flow of a river. Death, fires, war, floods, famine, sex, malnourished children in Yarmouk, malnourished women in Beverly Hills, swiping left, swiping right, chat rooms, saunas, jerking off to a sea of changing faces, sucking off one man, fisting another. What else to do in this ungovernable world but master control over his own body? What an achievement. The glaciers were melting, but he completed 50 double unders without breaking form. Palestine was being disappeared, but he doubled the weight of his snatches in a month. The Islamic State dissolved the concepts of Syria and Iraq, but his quads were indestructible. The Assad regime was starving hundreds of thousands, but if he ate nothing but boiled chicken for 3 days, he could glimpse the outline of his abs under the right lighting. How could he tell his mother that sex was salvation? that they could colonize his whole, but they would never colonize his mind. That he had sex because the world was getting warmer, hotter, so hot, baby. And that he could do nothing about the oil drilling, but yeah, mate, drill deep. And how afterwards he would lie on an unfamiliar bed in a euphoric calm that lasted a few minutes, and then the world would encroach, and he would have to find another, would have to keep moving, because to connect was to be shackled, to love was to be enslaved. Better to pass the bodies down the assembly line, moving along until suddenly and without warning, he would be walking down the street one summer, and a twink would yell out, "Hey, Daddy!" And he would turn around and realize that the twink was talking to him, that time had moved on, persistently, relentlessly, and he would have to clench his jaw to stop from screaming. "I haven't done any war reporting all year," he said. "I thought I told you." And I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saleem. And I think that kind of like sets us up really well. But the novel, yeah, it's very interesting because it's quite a different novel in voice and form from your previous work, Guapa, as well. Which kind of like Guapa was very much from one person's point of view, but this is very like kaleidoscopic. So it shifts from Nizar to Zainab to Mediha and Ishtar and Bridget as well. So those are kind of like all of the members of the Mazloom family, kind of like across generations. But I guess a good place to start would be to talk about the art, actually, because the story is very much kind of like punctuated by Iraqi art, and specifically someone who was inspired by Jawed Saleem, who is a family member of yours. And of course, there's kind of like a boat project of that attempts to go across the Tigris River, which is really a through line through the whole novel. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I'm my father is Palestinian Lebanese, and my mother is half Iraqi, half German. But I grew up very much within the Palestinian side of my family, and I was always interested in knowing more about the Iraqi side of my family, because the Iraqi side of my family were we come from generations of artists, and some more famous than others, and some very, very well known. And my experience of Iraq growing up was through art. It was that side of the family were not a political family in the sense that they did not discuss politics at home. They discussed art. In comparison to the Palestinian side of my family, where we were kind of consumed with politics all the time and talking about Palestinian politics. So when I was thinking about a next writing project, I thought it would be really interesting to use this as an opportunity to look a bit deeper into that side of the family, and to better understand it, and to better understand the legacy, the artistic legacy. And so I began to do research into that, and I was very much, this was around 2014, which is partly why I started this novel is set in 2014. And I was really interested in what drives certain people to produce certain art. And what I kind of ended up doing inadvertently was I worked with the real artworks of various members of the family, some still alive, most of them dead now, and used those as the starting point to then kind of begin to create characters, thinking, okay, well, we have certain art pieces that I find very beautiful or very thought-provoking. What kind of person would produce this art? What would that person's relationship be with the past, with Iraq, etc.? And I began to kind of create characters based on existing real-life artwork. So this one, actually, this cover is is my grandfather's painting from 1974. But there are other, this is not actually in the novel, but it was just the cover. But there are other very specific paintings that you can actually go online and then you can check and see that they really do exist, or sculptures, etc. So that was kind of my starting point for the novel. And one key part, which ended up being a key part of the novel, is this project by my uncle Rashad Saleem, which he did about 15 years ago now, where he was really interested in reviving Mesopotamian water vessels. And he was interested in doing an expedition, which he did do actually, down the Tigris River. And I remember when I was researching the novel, I met him a few times, and just to find out more about the family history and about his own art projects. And then it quickly became apparent to me that this had to form like the backbone of this idea of an expedition using traditional Mesopotamian water vessels had to form the backbone of it. And Rashad was really interested in the myth of the flood, and specifically the Mesopotamian version of the myth of the flood and what that represented for him. And for him, it was, he had an idea about what a Mesopotamian ark would actually look like in terms of bringing the different boats together. And I found it such a beautiful analogy in terms of bringing different parts of the river together and uniting the disparate sort of regions in Iraq. And I think as well I was really interested in the myth of the flood, because for me there's something really kind of a bit mad about the idea of building an ark. It's driven by this need to preserve something, in the face of like this, godly force of destruction. And there was something about it that kind of reminded me of what it's like to do art when you come from a place that's torn apart by war. It's very impractical, it's very unrealistic, but there is this kind of, you're driven by this desire to want to preserve something. And so it was the myth of the flood kind of was something that kept coming to my mind and became something that the characters themselves started to become consumed by as well. I was talking for a lot, hopefully you're able to follow that.
No, that's. You touched on so many points that I would kind of like to talk about more. I think it was just to kind of like go back to one of the first things. I think it's so interesting because you also, even though you say that kind of your family wasn't necessarily political, but they talked about art, because you also really politicize the art and the art making and the idea of culture building as well, especially kind of like in revolutionary era Iraq as well, when they were trying to determine kind of what sort of national identity do we want to build. And I think it's also kind of like placed in a very interesting frame, because the narrators in this novel are all somewhat unreliable. So do you want to talk about that a little bit, kind of like
about the unreliability, or about the role of politics and art?
I mean, both. Whichever one.
You're going to make me talk for another 10 minutes.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so around the role of politics and art, for sure. I mean, you cannot divorce art from politics. I think we can both agree on that. When I say that my family were talked a lot about art rather than politics, I meant more, not that their work was apolitical, which it wasn't, but actually a key part of their, especially that group of modern art, who were the artists that kind of started this movement in the 50s and 60s. They were really interested in, like, their project was yes, there was a political aspect to it, but it was also very much an aesthetic project. And for them, what they wanted to do, and what I found really inspiring about that movement, was kind of post-colonial Iraq, and it was right before the revolution that overthrew the monarchy that was backed by the British. So the British were still very much in control in Iraq. But what these artists wanted to do, and they were not just Iraqi artists actually, it was a very cosmopolitan group, but they wanted to kind of build a modern vision for what Iraqi art would look like that wasn't simply kind of looking back to the past of Iraq. They recognized that we need to look back to the past, and that as artists, as Iraqi artists, as artists working in Baghdad, we need to kind of root ourselves in the history of Mesopotamia, in the Sumerian civilizations, etc., etc. And so they kind of took a lot of inspiration through Sumerian artifacts, al-Wasliti, all of these different kind of artists that were not that popular then. They kind of brought them into the public artistic imagination, but they were not against the idea of utilizing Western techniques and learning from Western artists as well. So they saw themselves, perhaps in some ways naively, and perhaps in other ways kind of revolutionary, as this bridge, as this cosmopolitan bridge that would unite the East and the West. And I found that really interesting because it put them in a very difficult position, and they were criticized from all sides for it. And I kind of wanted to explore that in a way. I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah. And especially because the family members themselves kind of like got caught up in a lot of those discussions. That is a lot of what they ended up disagreeing on. Because the matriarch, Bridget as well, who is British, she met Haider in London. They got married, and then they kind of like lived in Iraq around kind of like the post-colonial revolutionary period, and they were working artists both together. And there was a lot that was also kind of like said about, just the role of a British person. So it's kind of like interesting to hear you talk about the cosmopolitan nature of the group, because obviously kind of they didn't try to place any limits on who can contribute to this movement. It's like they wanted everyone to kind of like have a seat at the table. They wanted to produce as much as possible, and especially like the way that you draw it out as well is that as such an exciting and generative time where a lot of things were possible.
And I mean, it's funny because I remember when I was researching this was also during the quote-unquote like refugee crisis, and there was a lot of discussion that was happening like 2014, 2015 around the boats and the refugees that were coming, etc. And during my research, I discovered that Jawad Saleem, who is the kind of the inspiration for one of the characters in here, Haidar, Jawad Saleem, who is the most famous in our family, and he built Nasb al-Hurriya, which is, I guess, the Liberty Monument or the Freedom Monument in Tahrir Square in Baghdad. He was really inspired, and he kind of learned to paint, or kind of learned a new way of painting through a group of Polish refugees who had come to Baghdad during the Second World War. And for him, that really kind of also opened his mind to say that actually there's so much that I can learn from everyone all over the world. And so it was this kind of example of this cultural exchange that really inspired him, and I think inspired the movement, in the sense that we have a lot to learn from each other. And it was just very funny to me that I was reading about the story of him, because I was reading his diaries, and he was talking about these amazing encounters he was having with these Polish refugee artists, and I was thinking about the refugees in Europe and how much they were vilified at the time. It was so it was kind of something that I really wanted to tap into as well.
It's such a kind of like a wealth of raw material to be able to draw from as well, to kind of like have family members' archives sort of be so accessible, because which goes on to sort of the second point, which is how people in the novel also kind of like relate to the past, because the past is very much something that is living. They are so just to kind of like paint a picture for folks in the audience. So Haidar and Bridget had three daughters, Mediha, Zainab, and Ishtar. And who are all artists in their own right as well. And it's mostly them and Nizar, who's Zainab's son, who we're following through this narrative. And we really see how because at this point in life, they're trying to find out what to do with their father's legacy, what to do with the paintings, how to frame it, and they have these constant debates. And a lot of it seems to be with them trying to reach into the past in a way where they can actually meet it and move on together. Because when we meet them in the very beginning, they're always kind of like clashing, and there's a lot of infighting.
There's a lot of fighting, yes.
Like how did you come up with those characters? Kind of like because you said that you felt you drew a lot of inspiration from the art that you encountered.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you can kind of like tell us about the.
So I mean, one of the first things when I was thinking about this novel was I had in mind, like, one of the first, I guess, central points of conflict that came to me was this idea of a family, like a family argument over legacy. And I think what I found really interesting was, can I draw parallels between conflicts between family members and kind of broaden that out to look at it at sort of at the national level. So what does conflict look like at the national level, and how like petty administrative conflicts within family members, and they're arguing over what to do, whether to sell off the paintings or whether to exhibit them and where to exhibit them, and that brings up all of these questions around the politics of the art market. But all of these things actually represent much deeper issues for all of the characters, and it was a process of discovery for me to be able to say why does Mediha want to sell the paintings so much? What is going on? What are her motivations that are driving her to do that? And so I kind of had her art, which was a hint, and then I had this stance that she took. And for me, it was really a question of like, how do these different characters, how have they metabolized the past? How have they kind of constructed narratives that made it easier for them to live their lives in the present? And what happens when these narratives are then coming into conflict with each other in the context of this very petty administrative fight? And it kind of mirrors for me the way that often, like especially a country like Iraq, which is quite multicultural in a lot of ways and multi-sectarian, let's say, how different communities have also constructed different memories of the past and different mythologies of the past. And I was interested in kind of what gets forgotten, not just memories at the family level, like what memories get forgotten or purposely buried, and what are the impacts of families deciding they're going to bury certain memories, but also at the national level, like what happens when a dictator like Saddam decides to do something and then bury the history of it, and then as a society you're forced to kind of move on, not even acknowledge that happened. What are the ramifications of that? So I was kind of playing around with those two ideas, I think.
It just reminds me of what Shakti was saying when kind of with regards to writing and thinking of kind of Arab histories, which is that so often we're thinking of actually kind of like dealing with the history where there is no documentation, where there is an active kind of like erasure of those stories, which I think is such an exciting place to actually situate a fiction novel as well, because along with all of that, there's a lot about the role of art, what art can accomplish for people. So yeah, was that something that went into your thinking when you were approaching the project?
Yes, but not in a conscious way, but subconsciously, yes. I think I was really questioning, because also I was working on this novel I started researching in 2014, 2015 I started researching it, and then I started writing in 2018, and so there have been many different kind of, let's say, to put it mildly, moments of crisis politically that kind of really shook or made me question a lot what I was doing. There was what happened in Lebanon. My parents live in Beirut, so I was very intimately connected to that. There's the genocide in Palestine, which really also shook kind of it made me really question why do we create art? What is it that we're doing? Why am I writing? What's the point of it? What should my creative energies be focused on? And I think that those questions also then kind of came into the book. But this also, and again to go back to ISIS, which is when this was set, I remember when I was watching the videos of ISIS destroying the cultural sort of cultural artifacts and these really historical monuments, and feeling this very strange feeling of like horror that, this thing from so long ago has just been reduced to rubble. But also feeling a certain amount, and I think one of the characters also feels that this sense of like, maybe there's a liberation in this somehow, because you're destroying this past that is so heavy, and it kind of allows an opportunity to move on, not ISIS, but as a concept, right? And I was kind of really interested in that interplay as well. So all of these things were kind of going through my mind as I was writing.
It's such an interesting. Is the mic on? Can y'all hear me? No. Right. I'll Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point of tension that you kind of like deal with, and just going back to the three sisters and kind of like how they deal with each other. I just loved the line when Mediha, I think, was criticizing or was talking to Zainab after her exhibition, and just said, to quote from the novel, Mediha rolled her eyes. I swear, every single member of our family has a disordered relationship to memory. She rested against the bar. We are all mini Saddams, rewriting history to suit our agendas.
I mean, and they are.
Yeah.
To be fair.
Yeah.
She's
Yeah.
right. She's not right about much, but she's right about
Yeah. and that's kind of like the fascinating thing. I think the really exciting thing when reading the novel is because you do sense the gaps, the absences that they're also working with, because they're kind of like, you see that they're really also all trying to do the best that they can with the information that they've been dealt. It's just that they haven't actually kind of like received enough to be able to move forward. And the whole book feels like an opportunity for them to kind of like meet each other and actually kind of like rather than be spectators and kind of like receptors of a fractured history that they've been passed down, but to actually meet it in a way where they can build some sort of sense of community around it and create something generative, which also happens with the boat project. It becomes about more than just them, and the people who end up helping them kind of like fall outside of their circle. It ends up becoming a bit of a unifying thing as well.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it ends up kind of bringing them together. But I think, I mean, I said this yesterday, but I think my intention with this, like I remember Donna Tartt when she was writing The Goldfinch, she said that she was working with this very tiny paintbrush, and her intention was to draw this massive painting, or paint this massive painting, and that only once you were done, because you were so focused on the intricate details of it, that as a reader you would step back and kind of see this painting. And that really stuck with me. And I kind of approached it from a similar perspective. Like I kind of wanted to draw a cubist painting or paint a cubist painting with this narrative, so that you have all of these disjointed memories and perspectives that kind of don't entirely fit together, but only really at the end of the novel, when you step back, do you kind of see this kind of cubist painting that there is an emotional coherence to it, even though the memories don't entirely line up. But you as a reader are able to at least kind of emotionally understand it, and make sense of this history through the different perspectives that come in. I don't know if that answered your question, but it just occurred to me.
No, it definitely does. I mean, and you definitely kind of like experience that moving through the narrative. And I had another thing that I wanted to say, which totally flew from my mind. Did you want to do another reading as well?
I mean, how much time do we have left?
So we have around 10 more minutes left, and then we'll go to audience questions.
Okay.
So start thinking of those questions.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do a reading. Maybe I'll read the British Museum one. Yeah. Okay, so this is set in the British Museum. It's slightly shorter, I think, than the last one, I think. Yeah, this is set in the British Museum, and this is the day before. This is again from the perspective of Nizar, who is Zainab's son, the war journalist. And this is right before him and his aunt Ishtar are about to fly to Iraq to go on this expedition down the Tigris River. The day before their flight, Ishtar asked to meet at the British Museum. To pay our respect to the ancient gods, she joked over the phone. Nizar spotted her leaning against the gate at the entrance on Great Russell Street. She was dressed in black and wore a long necklace with a gold replica of a Babylonian incantation bowl. A leather messenger bag rested by her feet. You look nice, Nizar said. Ishtar ignored this. Did you know that in the 2003 war alone, nearly 15,000 items were pillaged from the Iraqi museum, and most have never been found? In the foyer, an attendant asked if they would like to donate money to support the upkeep of the museum. Have you not looted enough from our people already? Ishtar said. They headed straight to the Mesopotamian rooms. Shuffling past tourists and school children, they stopped at a glass casing. Inside rested a fragment of a baked clay tablet the color of river silt. They stood in silence in the controlled and sterile air, examining the cracked artifact, their faces ghosts on the glass. Nizar thought of his grandfather, working in the Iraqi museum while Europe burned. The work had filled his grandfather with a melancholic hope. Everything would end. The death of the Sumerians and Babylonians were proof of that. But the kernels of life in his hands were an assurance that not all would be lost. Perhaps the only way to create a viable future was to rebuild one's relationship with history. But if that were true, Nizar thought, why did history feel so unbearably heavy? One thing that's been lost is how queer the Epic of Gilgamesh actually is, Ishtar said. Translators throughout history, nearly always white heterosexual men, have downplayed the queerness of the love between Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Before meeting Enkidu, Gilgamesh had a prophetic dream, where his mother tells him that a strong partner will come to him. You will take him in your arms, embrace and caress him, the way a man caresses his wife. Ishtar turned to Nizar. Is that not the gayest thing you've ever heard? Nizar thought of the rituals and jokes he and Alfie had cultivated, how over time they had begun to seem incomprehensible to the both of them, a language they had once been fluent in, now heavy and strange on their tongues. How a missing sock became a metaphor for the world's injustices, and a witch hunt that Nizar would hang over his lover's head for days. Who gives a shit, Alfie would say. It's just a sock, let it go. Trust the white man to just want to let things go. Baghdad's destroyed and Blair still prances around on television, but sure, let's forget the invasion of Iraq, shall we? Let's just let it go. No point in holding on to the past. And as the bodies piled up in Homs, Baghdad, Aden, Cairo, Tripoli, and Gaza, each carcass was an affirmation. Mentioning the massacres to Alfie and his friends during nights out had resulted in awkward silences or tuts of pity, as if the bodies were only Nizar's to bury and mourn. How could he make them understand that this pain belonged to them too? In private, Alfie had made heartfelt appeals for Nizar to see a therapist. When he dismissed these attempts to personalize his political rage, Alfie called him difficult. Perhaps his Iraqi genes were responsible. The genes that understood how a small blip centuries ago could reverberate in the present. The genes that recognized history is not a river that runs clear, but a mountain range built on centuries of tiny moments that shape a person irrevocably. No, he would not let the fucking sock go. I'd like to grab the tablet and take it to Iraq, Ishtar said, cutting through Nizar's thoughts. Can you imagine? We'd build an ark to house all these stolen pieces and return them to their rightful place. It's infuriating, Nizar looked around, taking in the hall of vitrines containing thousands of stolen artifacts. How our past sits in the museums of empires. It's like walking into a hunter's home and seeing your mother's head above the fireplace, Ishtar said. She set her palm flat on the cool glass case. We've lost so much. The missing tablets, which carry our story forward, are also gone forever. On the positive side, Nizar replied, think of the potential spaces opened up in their absence. We can fill the missing lines with new stories. The lost fragments are like cracks in a stone that allow fresh growth to take root. Ishtar considered this. Perhaps, she said. They walked through the remaining rooms in silence, taking in the monumental gate slabs, carved guardians, and amputated statues. Nizar looked at the faces cut into the stone, the missing lips and noses lost to history. He kept his hands at his sides, resisting the urge to touch, to feel the weight of their history on his skin. His chest tightened as he considered the years passing, the deep stretches of time, and how it had only been 10 months, though it felt like a lifetime, since he had heard himself say the words, "This isn't working." They had argued about something, and though Nizar could not remember what it was about, he recalled with perfect clarity how the hours of tense sparring had left him and Alfie in the familiar state of sickly, all-encompassing exhaustion. What do you mean? Alfie's eyes were red and swollen. We need some time apart, Nizar said. I've already found a sublet. Of course you have. He'd waited for Alfie to say something else, but as the minutes passed, he felt the last 5 years of their lives setting like a dying sun. When Alfie grabbed his keys and walked out of the house, Nizar could only sit at the kitchen table, staring at Alfie's half-empty glass of orange juice. The threat of the rupture had been hanging over him for so long that when Nizar heard the faint click of the front door closing, relief washed over him. He felt like some sort of order had been restored in the world. Since that day, Nizar had operated as if history did not matter, as if the present was the only thing that existed. He recalled the first night in his new sublet, how he had slept alone and dreamt about water. Putrid and yellow, flowing from the crack under the door and the tiny slits between the windows, seeping through the walls and slowly darkening the carpet. The water came towards him, and he felt helpless as it licked his toes, crept up his knees and chest, and seeped into his mouth. Now, surrounded by Assyrian and Sumerian relics, he felt himself drowning in this room of stolen artifacts, carrying the crushing weight of thousands of years of loss. "I need some air," he said. "I'll see you outside." He turned, quickly escaping down the hall and into the sun-drenched foyer where he could breathe. He ordered a coffee at the cafe next to the gift shop. Through the glass ceiling, rays of sunlight danced against the white marble. Suddenly his aunt was beside him. "The plaque on the stone sculpture from the Easter Islands claims it was a gift from Queen Victoria," Ishtar said. "Can you believe the cheek of it?" She saw Nizar's face, and her voice softened. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, it's just, there's no escaping the past." He expected Ishtar to laugh at this sudden display of emotion, but her eyes contained no judgment. "For me, the past is a source of sad comfort," she said. "I suppose that's where we differ." Nizar finished the rest of his coffee and crushed the paper cup in his fist. Alfie had never understood how history illuminated contemporary pain, and this contributed to the fissures that had torn them apart. History was a prison, he was learning, but if you had the key, there was much inside to be learned. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I feel like I have so many more questions, but I'll open it up to the audience. If anyone has a question, just throw up a hand. If it's in the audience, I'll read it. I'll repeat it so people online can just.
Hi, thank you so much for that. I thought it was wonderful. You said at the end there about history and the idea of the key to the past. I wondered if the writing of this book, which has obviously been quite a long process for you, has been like a key for you to your past and what that's been like for you.
Sorry, I'll just repeat the question real quick. So the question was about just one of the lines in the reading just now, which said talking about a key to the past and history being a key to the past. And the question was whether this book in some way was a key to the past for Saleem.
That's such a fantastic question. And I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head, and I'm only realizing it now because I'm just starting to talk about the book. But yes, I think in many ways it was for me because I think this researching this novel, and it was a research project that went on for many years and had so many detours and really unexpected places that kind of never really found their way into the novel. But I think for me it was really the key to understanding a big part of my own history, but also a big part of my own kind of the kind of creative vision and the legacies, the artistic legacies that I come from, and how and what I can learn from them as an artist and as a person. And I don't necessarily think that I was aware that I was doing this. I think it was a very subconscious process, but I think for sure it was, absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah.
So thank you so much. I'm also Iraqi, and my mom's side of the family are also artists. But so it's really interesting to hear you talk about how it's been so hard to kind of get anything out of them in terms of the history, because it is very buried and there's so much pain. And actually I was wondering, because especially because you have your Palestinian side, where I've always noticed that with Palestinians, they're able to point exactly to what village they come from, talk about every generation of any kind of atrocity that has happened towards them, whereas Iraqis, we tend to forget, or not maybe forget, but try not to talk about it and move past it. And I wondered throughout this process whether you kind of realized that separation and how it was to talk to parts of your family that maybe wanted to push the past a bit further away. And also, I mean, as was mentioned, there's not so much written material about the history of Iraq, and even now with the recent history, there's not so much about what has happened, even with Daesh, all of these things. So I guess I'm wondering like what that process was like for you, especially to have that comparison with the Palestinian side that is much more vocal maybe about the history and everything.
Yeah. It's a good question. What's funny is that I think I can only speak. I totally agree with you about like this. That I went to Baghdad this time last year, and it was really interesting for me. And I hadn't been back since I was a child to Baghdad, and it was really interesting because I would kind of speak to people, and first of all, I was surprised by how safe it was. And talking to people about why that was, and people would say, oh, well, you know, people just got tired of fighting all the time. But I felt like that was also a very kind of neat way to close the topic of conversation about things. But I feel like, and I think we were talking about this earlier, about how one of the characters says that we don't need a museum in Iraq. We don't need a museum of remembrance. Yeah, you see, I can't remember what I had written. Who needs a museum when you're living amid the destruction? What we need is a museum of forgetting. And I think that sometimes that you know, because especially the recent history of Iraq has been so traumatizing, and everyone who's still in Iraq has a really horrific story, which actually I kind of discovered after digging a bit deeper past that, like really horrific stories. I think I can understand this need to forget, and also, at least when I speak to my mother about her time in Iraq, I think there's this realization that she was living in a bubble, and I think it's she now realizes that she was living in a bubble, and I think that realization is also hard to deal with. But I don't know how it transposes to the Palestinian situation, because also the Palestinian situation, remembering is is an act of resistance in itself, and it's like a resisting erasure. So I think that kind of has a different purpose. It has a political purpose when you tell children about it. But what's funny actually is that my grandmother, like in the last 2 or 3 years of her life, and she was the last surviving member of the Nakba, she would refuse to talk about Palestine, and when we try to push her about it, and she used to always talk a lot, she would say it's in the past, just let it go, give it up, it's over. So I don't know, I mean, I think it also depends.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, Dan.
I was just wondering how you see, or whether you see, I guess, this book, like your art, in conversation, or as part of kind of like the lineage of your family, or like in concert even, or whether you see it as kind of as a response or quite separate.
So the question about whether Saleem sees the book as kind of like in concert and dialogue with the rest of the family, is kind of like creative production.
You might put it much better than I did.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I never used to, actually. And then with this book, obviously, it was something that I had to kind of reckon with. And my family's work, the Iraqi side of my family's art, is very optimistic and very hopeful. And I've always struggled with optimistic works and with hopeful works. But with this book, and actually one of the criticisms that some members of my family have about this book is because it starts with so much negativity and conflict. They're like, but how can this be inspired by our family's art? Our family's art is positive and hopeful. But for me, and I think I told you, like, I knew what the ending was, and this is not a spoiler to say that the ending is an optimistic one, and it's one where there's hope. So I knew that's where I was going to go. And I think it just took a really long journey for me to get from this stage, because I felt like I wanted this to be an optimistic piece of work, but it had to feel earned. I was not going to just be sentimental or nostalgic, the two things that I really despise, just for the sake of being sentimental and nostalgic. It has to feel earned. So I needed to put the characters through like the ringer, basically, to get them to the end. And I think also it was a question for me, because it was a question like of, I want to produce art that's hopeful. But how? How does one produce art that's hopeful? Forgetting, like, you know, my great uncle who was working in the 50s, which were a much more hopeful time than we're working now. But how, in the midst of what we're living through, do we make hopeful art? Like, how do we have the audacity to do that? And I think writing this novel was my way of trying to find a way through that. To figure out how we can be hopeful and how we can make art that is hopeful in the midst of what we're living through.
And I think it does such an interesting job, again, of kind of like just looking at the material conditions that actually kind of like help make art possible. Like, it is an integral part of, it's a very significant thing that Ishtar also thinks about. There's this incredible line when she's talking with Nizar about kind of like, well, how do we go about actually kind of like producing this book project? And Nizar asks, but what about ISIS? And she says, ISIS can go fuck themselves. The real challenge will be finding someone to fund this. So it's kind of like it's very much in conversation, like it is very much helpful. It is also kind of like very much grounded in the space and the time that it's set in. It doesn't kind of like try to gloss over any of the kind of like the difficulties that someone might experience to actually kind of like set out on that project.
Yeah, I mean, especially because their father in the story, in the novel, their father was working in the 50s when the Iraqi state was very much supporting the arts and was kind of seeing it as part of their political project. And Ishtar and her sisters are working at a time where they're, as Iraqi artists, they're kind of stuck between two worlds. They're stuck between the Western art market that sees them as, well, not super sexy. And Iraq is not sexy anymore. Now people are interested in Syria or the Arab Spring, and having to, you know, in the case of Mediha, maybe tailor their work towards a certain kind of Western aesthetic of violence. And then you have Zainab, who's the other sister, who's based in Dubai. And that's the other center of power when it comes to Arab artists, because that's where the money is, the Gulf. But that comes with a lot of strings attached and a lot of political issues that they need to deal with. And so Zainab is kind of navigating that in her own way. And Ishtar is the one who's really kind of rejecting both of those worlds and just kind of going in her own way, even though she ends up taking American money, but kind of in a, you know, to do her project. But so I was interested in these conversations, because I think it's conversations that I know that, you know, my family have had about, like, you know, what to do with the family paintings and where to put it and the pros and cons of these things, obviously in a much more civilized way than these sisters are talking. But and so I kind of wanted to explore that, the challenges of being an artist from Egypt, from Lebanon, from Iraq, from Palestine, when you're suddenly faced with these two centers of power that are instrumentalizing your work in different ways.
And that was like the one other thing as well, kind of like that I wanted to mention, is that the book, when I read it, it felt like, because I think so many books that talk about our countries kind of like end up trying to explain to a Western audience. I think this book kind of like just gets people on board very quickly and doesn't over-explain at all. It just kind of like expects you to follow it, which I absolutely loved. We have time for one more burning question. Is there one online?
Yeah, there's one online.
Okay, but just on that point, my point was not like to challenge readers necessarily, but to get them curious. And I think one thing that people have been telling me is that, like, they'll read something and then they'll be like, oh, I actually want to discover more about this, and then they'll kind of go down this rabbit hole. So for example, like there's talk about this village called Hasan Keyf, which is a Turkish Kurdish village that was flooded, I think in 2018 or 2020, but because it's set in 2014, they're able to go there, etc. But this is actually a real village that's ancient, it's 12,000 years old, that has now been completely flooded by the building of a dam. And so that kind of opens up whole conversation. So my hope is that, you know, you'll read something in this book and then you'll say, this is interesting, and then you Google it. And you kind of enter into the same kind of process that I entered into as I was researching this book, which is, yeah.
I love that.
So this is a question from Raya, who says, I love the interplay of art forms across your work, and while it has been 10 years between your novels, you have done films and so much more. How do you decide what forms your stories take, and has that brought you different audiences?
That's a very good question.
Especially you painted as well for a while.
Yeah, I was painting for a while, but I don't know if it's a conscious choice. I know that sometimes I'll try and work. You know, I often think to myself, like, is this a script? Is this a short story? And as I was telling you downstairs, like I had published a short story that I'm now that I've turned into a novella, and I'm asking questions about whether that's a novella. I don't know. It's usually a gut feeling, and sometimes I'll go down a path and realize that it's not supposed to be that way. And but oftentimes it's a matter of waiting, where an idea will stay with me for a while. But novels are my love. So like novels are my immediate go-to. If I can do anything, if I could turn anything into a novel, I would. It's only when I realize it's not a novel that I then move to other things.
It also just kind of like low-key blows my mind that you published Guapa between kind of like starting to write this novel and publishing it, because you started writing it in 2014. We're thinking about it, and you published Guapa in 2016.
Yes, and then I was touring for 2 years, which is why also I was not really writing in those years. I was researching more.
Yeah, amazing. Any last burning questions? We have time for one more short question.
I can give a wee point of order, which is just for afterwards. The Edinburgh University's Writer-in-Residence has sponsored some wine and baklava, and so those are set up in the fiction room. So if you were too shy to ask your question, you can stick around, get a book signed, ask it then, or just like linger and hang out and enjoy the space afterwards as well.
Can we buy books as well, or is it? Books
Oh yeah, we're here. We're here.
I'm asking for myself.
So, any last?
Okay, a second. Could you speak about the relationship between queerness and the family dynasty novel? I feel like maybe you've written here.
Wow, that's a big question. I'm not sure I can speak on it with any authority, but I can speak on it from my perspective. We had a chat a little bit about this, in the sense that, you know, there are multiple queer characters in the novel. Nizar, obviously, whose perspective I've been reading from, is queer. But then the Ishtar is also a queer character, and then there's another character who's from the 50s who's queer, which I think we don't need to reveal that, maybe. But I think for me, I mean, I just see, I don't know, I mean, I feel like there's a lot of queerness in my own family, and there are a lot of characters as well that go back that we think that they might have been queer. And so I think that was something that just came naturally, but it wasn't something that I was actively trying to do, honestly. So I don't know if I have anything more to say on that. Do you have anything to say? Okay. Okay.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So yeah, that's all the time we have. If you can put your hands together and say thank you for this. So before getting up, if you'll just give us a wee moment to go through to the other room, and you can join us just through there. Thank you.